One director that has led an interesting career despite never rising to Hollywood's A-list is Joe Dante. He is best known for 1984's Gremlins, which blended Frank Capra-esque visuals and comedy with maniacal goblin-like monsters, and its self-satirizing sequel, Gremlins 2: The New Batch, released in 1990. Dante, born and raised in New Jersey, got its first big break thanks to prolific director-producer-showman Roger Corman. In the 1970s, the already established Corman launched his own low-budget studio, New World Pictures. New World produced and/or distributed all sorts of films and helped future industry legends like John Sayles, James Cameron, and many others get their starts. Dante gradually climbed up the New World food chain, starting by editing trailers, and ultimately directed Piranha, a 1978 film penned by Sayles with affectionately parodied Jaws. Dante and Sayles would later reteam for The Howling, which along with An American Werewolf in London and Wolfen made 1981 the year of the postmodern werewolf movie. Elsewhere in Hollywood, then rising industry favorite Steven Spielberg had his eye on Dante's work. Spielberg not only liked Piranha and The Howling, but he also cast the latter's lead actress Dee Wallace as the mother in his classic E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Around this time, Spielberg started his production company Amblin in association with producer couple Frank Marshall and Kathleen Kennedy. As Raiders of the Lost Ark thrilled audiences and E.T. was being made, Spielberg was gaining the credibility to not only direct any film he wanted, but he also could use Amblin to produce movies from other directors, be they veterans or newcomers. The 1980s was proving to be a fruitful time for films involving science fiction, horror, and fantasy. Special effects were evolving at a rapid rate, and features like E.T. and the Star Wars saga's Yoda felt practically as human as their flesh and blood co-stars. And The Howling and American Werewolf were just the start of a cycle of films that combined horror with humor. Gremlins would intersect these two cinematic trends, proving to be its immediate creature feature, in which the monsters were perhaps the funniest characters. Circa 1981, Chris Columbus, later known as the director of Home Alone and the first two Harry Potter films, was a student at New York University Film School. While sleeping at night in his loft apartment, Columbus often heard an apparent army of rats shrieking and chattering around in the dark. He went on to say that it was more frightening than the pack of German shepherds. Thus, he was inspired to write a movie about a horde of little vile beasties. He called it Gremlins after the modern mythology of technology-wrecking imps popularized by British Army pilots during World War II. Columbus's original draft for Gremlins first floated around Hollywood under the pretense of being a writing sample. Given that Columbus went on to describe the slasher movies of the time as misogynistic trash, perhaps he was somewhat embarrassed by the weakness of his own scripted brainchild. Early drafts were far darker than the final film, and the human protagonists were not much more developed than the teenage victims one would expect to find in a Friday the 13th film. Even before settling into slimy cocoons, the furry Mogwai, named after a Chinese word for devil, ate the young hero Billy's pet dog. There was also a scene of Billy coming home to find his mother's decapitated head roll down the stairs. There was still some humor, with the protagonist taking refuge in a McDonald's where all the customers have been eaten by the monsters, but the hamburgers are left untouched. Columbus's very first draft had young children as the leads, which Spielberg felt was too much like E.T. So the second draft aged Billy to be a young man working as a bank teller alongside his love interest, who is named Kate Berenger in the final film. By the spring of 1982, Joe Dante thought his days in Hollywood were numbered and was almost ready to go back to New Jersey. He spent a year developing a film that would scrap when its production company was sold, and he didn't even get paid for its time and effort. To get by, he directed a few episodes of the short-lived Police Squad, which would years later spun off into the beloved Naked Gun movies. One fateful day, Dante and his producing partner Mike Fennell were surprised when mail from Steven Spielberg arrived at their tattered office. Dante at first thought it had been sent to the wrong address. Inside was a copy of the second draft to Gremlins. Dante met with Spielberg, then in post-production on both E.T. and Poltergeist and about the Titchmarsh ambulance workflow. Spielberg's close relationship with Stephen Ross of Warner Brothers helped to lead to the major studio funding Gremlins. But WB's people hesitated, as they thought the movie sounded rather strange. There were concerns over the budget, and many drafts were written by Columbus with the aid of Spielberg, Dante, and company before the story became more family-friendly. The film's development period was so long that in the middle of it, Dante was given the chance to direct a segment of Twilight Zone the movie for Spielberg and Warner Brothers. Dante had never stepped foot on a studio lot outside the Universal tour prior to this, and his nightmarishly cartoonish take on Twilight Zone's It's a Good Life was well received. By the spring of 1983, pre-production on Gremlins was finally in full swing. Frequent David Cronenberg, collaborator Trish Waylitz, and his Bay Area crew were chosen to provide creature effects. Spielberg abruptly chose to make a major change to the film's plot right before filming commenced. The plan had been that Gizmo, the cute Mogwai who early in the film becomes Billy's beloved new pet, would eat after midnight and then turn into an evil gremlin. Spielberg felt this was a bad idea since he knew audiences would love Gizmo. So a last-minute rewrite added another member to the meaner Mogwai spawned by Gizmo. Said Mogwai, named Stripe for his ripe tuft of a mohawk, served as the leader of the Gremlins both before and after their pupa stage. Gizmo would continue to be a Mogwai and loyal friend of Billy's throughout the entire film. The separation of Gizmo and Stripe into different characters crystallized the movie's tone and identity, but compounded the chaos of the film's production. To ease scenes, after initial principal photography wrapped, the crew took a break for a few weeks and then came back to film shots that only featured the creatures. Warner Brothers still didn't understand the movie, but had few specific problems with it. They did insist on removing a scene in which Kate recalls how her father died in an accident impersonating Santa Claus. Spielberg didn't care for this bit of dark comedy, but left the decision up to Dante. Dante felt the scene summed up the spirit of the movie, so it stayed in. Warner Brothers eventually warmed up to the film. When they first saw dailies involving Gizmo, they finally realized how adorable the little fuzzball was. So, in the post-Star Wars era, it only made sense to license as much Gremlins merchandise as possible. Gremlins, like E.T., had a ton of merchandise rushed out to coincide with its theatrical release. Regrettably, the decision to showcase Gizmo on most of the film's tie-ins gave the false impression that Gremlins was a spiritual sequel to E.T. And when the film had its very first screening, Warner Brothers finally understood Dante and company's vision. They realized that the film was meant to serve as a roller coaster ride of Yuletide cheer, horror, action, and Looney Tunes inspired rattiness. Then, June 8th, 1984, saw Gremlins open alongside another instant classic, Ivan Reitman's Ghostbusters. While Ghostbusters went on to become the bigger hit and would launch a larger franchise than Gremlins has, Dante noted that his film made more money in New York theaters.